Linda is the director of the OregonFlora and a research assistant professor in the Department of Botany and Plant Pathology at Oregon State University. Linda guides the OregonFlora program in its mission to share information about Oregon's plant diversity, largely through the production of estate flora in both book format and as an interactive website. And Linda, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me as a speaker. So thanks for joining, everyone. And what I will be doing is telling you a bit about OregonFlora and the resources what our program is, what we do, the resources that we offer, and how that relates to your interest in gardening and landscaping, especially with native plants. So let me share my screen here. Okay. So can somebody give me an okay that you're seeing that, Jet?
Looks great.
Okay, awesome. Okay, Oregon obviously has a lot of different types of landscapes and consequently a lot of different plants here. And with all of this information and all of this resource, this natural resource that we have, with any big collection, it's good to have a good grasp of what is here, and that helps us understand it better, learn more about it, and track that information so we can be mindful of any changes that are occurring, or dig deeper into the knowledge that we gain about our plant diversity and our natural history treasures that we have in the state. And so that's exactly what our program does. OregonFlora started back in 1994. We're a program that's based at Oregon State University, and we are also a self-funded program, and meaning that all of our resources come from money that we obtain through grants or donations. And it was started by the late Scott Sundberg, Dr. Scott Sundberg, who came to Oregon State University because there's this incredible resource here, which is the OSU Herbarium. A herbarium is a collection of dried, pressed plant specimens. So it's sort of like a combination between a library and a museum, in that all of this information is present in the form of actual plants, dried plants that you can touch and read the label information that is all about that particular collection. And so it was that information and these specimens that was the best collection of Oregon plant specimens anywhere in the world, quite honestly, that drew Scott to Oregon State University as a place to do what he had always wanted to do as a native Eugene resident and a nature lover. He always wanted to create an updated flora for the state of Oregon. So this was definitely the place to be, because we had this great resource of all of these historic records of the plants of the state. And the reason that Scott wanted to make a new flora is because the last one was only updated in 1961. And that's a long time to have in between important references that are going to be guiding land management decisions. Think about the federal agencies such as the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management that, collectively own more than half of the property in our state. And to be using a reference that was 40, 50 years old to make decisions on how these millions of acres might be treated is kind of, there's a lot of room for improvement there. New plants are always coming in. We have new species that are being discovered. Taxonomy is always changing. And so there's so much information in this dynamic field of plant diversity and biodiversity that needed to be brought up to date and then kept current. And so that was sort of the objective of creating the OregonFlora project, as we were originally called. Now we're called OregonFlora. So what was Scott facing when he first came to this place to do this work, and gathering all of the information that was available at that time and then building upon that? Well, one of the first things to do is make a list of what you've got. So he started working on a checklist, and that was looking at the information largely from the herbarium, from other researchers and government agencies, the Native Plant Society, as to what plants had been documented of occurring in the state. Now, that would be both native and non-native plants. The Flora of Oregon, what we cover is all of the plants, the vascular plants that grow in the state in the wilds, that is without being cultivated, like pansies or arugula. So right now, we recognize that there are 4,747 different unique plants growing in the state in the wild. So that's a lot, right? That was the start of building this list and getting the documentation for it, and then the whole process of writing a flora, or gathering all of the relevant information about all of these almost 5,000 different plants, started from that point and carried on to include some of the things that I'm going to be telling you about shortly. So here's just some numbers to sort of bring home how diverse our marvelous state is. So within there are 165 plant families that are recognized that contain all these unique plants, and you can go down and see all of these different numbers. So let's look at that number 10,595. Okay, so what's the difference between a scientific name in our database and those 4,700 plants that I mentioned? Well, scientific names of things often change, and this reflects new knowledge that we have, and also just the idea of, what a person or a group's idea consists of in terms of how they define a particular plant or the essence of a plant. And so sometimes that creates different names. And so those are called synonyms, and we keep track of those and then provide the ability to cross-reference them. So you may be familiar with Oregon grape, our state plant, as Mahonia aquifolium. Well, Mahonia is one name for it, and the scientific literature, the latest information is that scientists and taxonomists refer to it as Berberis. So those two names are synonyms, and they point to the same idea or the same concept of a plant, but we keep track of those. And so that's how there are so many names that we are monitoring and working with in our database. So there's that gives you, as a user of some of our resources, the understanding of plants, even if you're familiar with a name that OregonFlora sees as different from the accepted name. So that's a really valuable tool that's part of this. You can also see that, as I mentioned, from these numbers of the increases in the number of taxa and the changes that happen, that botany, plant diversity, the study of the relationships, which is taxonomy, is a really dynamic field. And it's really one of the main jobs of a flora, or this botanical reference, is to keep track of these things so that people know the latest information, what we're looking at, and how that relates to what we might have familiarity with from previous or other references. So again, why do we need a flora? It's back to having some source that will let us know and sort of give us a stake in the sand as to what the diversity of an area is. OregonFlora, as our name implies, has defined our area of interest as the state of Oregon. And this by defining this, then that gives us, you know, a scope in which to look at, or a lens through which we can focus on things. And plant information, if I were to ask you, where do you find out about plants? And say the internet. Well, where does the internet find out about it? Or where do gardening resources find out about it? How do you know that something's a perennial, or that it's got really deep roots, or pink flowers? Well, that core information, even for all these different applications, such as the horticultural field, gardening, agriculture, restoration, all of these things depend on this fundamental descriptions of plants, the habitats they grow in, and the distribution in which they naturally occur. And that's all information that's gathered in a flora. So it can be relevant to a lot of different fields, even though the essence of a flora can be really technical and sort of scholarly feeling. It has really broad reach. And as I mentioned at the beginning, with so much of our land being public lands that is owned by governmental agencies, that's a really good example of how land managers need this kind of information to make good decisions. However, as a gardener or a landscaper, you too are a land manager. Your scale may be much smaller than the Bureau of Land Management, but you are making decisions about the plant life that is occurring in your place. What do you want to encourage? What are you aware of that is there? What sort of diversity does exist in your plot? How might you want to change that depending upon your interest, or what works best with the piece of land that you're looking at? So another thing that floras are absolutely essential for is identifying plants. And in the book version of a flora, that typically appears as a dichotomous key, where you're given pairs of characters, and then you choose, if you have some unknown plant that you picked somewhere, you choose the suite of characters from option 1 or option 2 of those pairs that best matches your unknown plant, and that'll guide you to the next step. And so through that method, you can get down to the assignment of a scientific name, and then look and read the detailed description about that particular plant. So floras also provide context, in that they help you get a better understanding of what all is in an area. How do these plants compare to one another, whether you're looking at a different species or two, or you're looking at things within a plant family, or within an ecoregion, move to the landscape level. And they also then help us understand how humans relate to plants in these plant communities. And I think that's a really valuable part of this kind of knowledge, and something that is certainly appreciated in this audience. So the Flora of Oregon takes two forms in our world, in the Oregon Flora world. And the first is these published books, and we have volumes 1 and 2 published, and they cover all 3 volumes are going to cover all of those plants that exist in Oregon, those 4,000 something plants that grow in the wild. So the books contain information about the native and the naturalized plants that grow without cultivation in our state. And we've arranged them alphabetically because most people have a good grasp of the alphabet. And volume 1 over here contains information about the ferns, the conifers, and the monocots. So monocots include things like irises, grass, sedges, lilies. And then volumes 2 and 3 are alphabetically basically the first half of the plant families from Adoxaceae to Fagaceae. So some big hitters in that include things in the sunflower family, in the mustard family, the stone crops, legumes in the Fabaceae, and the oaks. Volume 3, we are closing in on finishing Volume 3, and we'll get that to people in people's hands, hopefully in very early 2025, so not too long from now, considering how big the scope of this work is. And that some of the big families in that volume are going to be the rose family, Polygonaceae, the willows, and things that used to be in the Scrophulariaceae, or the snapdragon family, such as monkey flowers and penstemons. And so another thing that our books have is these chapters in the front that give you some context about the plant life around us. But I mentioned that before. So again, I was describing, here's some pages actually from the flora. And over on the left-hand side, you'll see these dichotomous keys where you have pairs of characters. And so this is what a dichotomous key looks like for those of you who might not be familiar with those. And then each species on the right-hand page has a detailed description. You see those, just all of these measurements about the features of a plant, going from the whole plant down to the seeds and details of leaves and hairs and things like that. We also have a little thumbnail map that shows where these plants have been documented as occurring. That's going back to our OSU herbarium connections and ties, and the ecoregions in which they occur. We also have some beautiful artwork, something that is not very common in floras, in printed floras these days. One of the key illustrator for our book is on our staff, John Myers, and he's done some amazing artwork to help further illustrate the concepts that you encounter in looking at plants. Okay, so back to the context of why that's an important thing to OregonFlora, that we help people understand the relationships that they have with plants. And this takes the form of front chapters that have all these beautiful color photographs and talk about different topics. Here's pages from our chapter on plant-insect interactions, and Andrea is going to be talking some more about that, at least partly about pollinators and other insects that visit, and their relationships with plants in gardens. And then we also have one about landscaping, a chapter about landscaping with native plants. And on the left-hand side is a page from an appendix related to that. Volume 3, this one that we're about to publish, is going to have chapters about ethnobotany and about climate change. So let me ask you, if you were to be blindfolded and spun around, and just like in the Wizard of Oz, you click your heels and you drop down in a different place, and you opened your eyes, took off that blindfold, and this is what you saw, what might you use to deduce where you were? So let's look at this picture and think about some of the things that might clue you in to give you an idea about where you have landed. So I see some dry, gray-looking grasses. They look very healthy. I see rocks, what looks like a rocky soil on a mountain sort of extending up in the background, these juniper-looking trees. It looks pretty bright, implying there's lots of sun, and it definitely looks to me like there isn't a whole lot of water standing around. My feet certainly aren't going to get muddy here. So some of the characteristics that you can deduce will tell you some ideas about where you are. So while I can't easily get some feedback from y'all on this, maybe some of you guessed that this is from Eastern Oregon, and you are right. Indeed, it is from Jefferson County. So now let's look at a different picture. So put that blindfold back on, spin yourself around again, and now you end up here. So here your feet might be getting wet. It's certainly different color of green. There's all of this spike rush, grassy looking stuff down at your feet, and then sort of a hedgerow of trees up in the distance. And again, piecing together all this information, you would have a pretty good guess if you said, I'm somewhere in the Willamette Valley, because indeed this is in your very own Lane County. So what hopefully each of you exercised in this little mind game, or this little thought experiment, was that you're putting together all of the pieces that really help define an ecoregion. So you assessed from whether you have massive knowledge about the details of the plants or just a little bit or none at all. You deduced that the type of plants that are growing in a place, the kinds of morphologies or forms that these plants take, are they, sort of waxy, or they rosinous, or they, a color that would reflect light? How much non-biotic or abiotic features are there? The light, the soils, the apparent moisture, maybe the aspect of light can also help tell you that. So those combinations of living and non-living characteristics of an area are the pieces that help one define and circumscribe ecoregions. And ecoregions are a really useful lens through which to view our natural, our botanical environment. And so this kind of information is something that OregonFlora uses to sort of to frame how we think about things and what we can expect to find when we're in a particular region. We recognize 11 different ecoregions, as seen in these different colored regions, ranging from the West Coast to the coastal area, through the Coast Range and Willamette Valley, over to Eastern Oregon. And these can also be useful as a gardener and a landscaper, because it helps you understand what plant diversity occurs for a set of existing abiotic conditions. And also you can get an idea about the distribution and microhabitats that a plant might thrive in. And so understanding the ecoregions and what plants occur naturally in a particular ecoregion helps us find a reference system that we can use to sort of model any sort of planted environments we want to create. So again, let's advance this slide. So just as, here's just some pretty pictures sort of walking through all of those different ecoregions, and just with a quick glance, you can see the different plant communities that might be found in some of these. So we live in the, or at least most of us in Lane or Benton County live in Kalapuya land, and that's the Willamette Valley. And this picture in the upper right is some of the oak prairies and oak savannas that at one time used to cover a great deal of the Willamette Valley. Agriculture and urban development have eliminated the vast majority of Oregon's Willamette Valley ecoregions and habitats, unfortunately, but it's something that we can think of as a reference, and something we might try to try and enhance in our own little piece of land that we are managing. Okay, so I think one of the titles of this little workshop or set of series is about native plants. Well, what is a native? And that can actually be kind of a squishy question, or have kind of a squishy answer. I guess the question is precise, but the answer might be a little hard to pin down at times. And one of the reasons is like most things, it depends, right? And so you have to think about how are you considering native, and what sort of again, sort of container are you considering native? First of all, some basic parameters that certainly what OregonFlora thinks of that contribute to designating a plant species native is, did it occur in a place independent of humans moving it around or trafficking it or planting it or removing it or something like that? And so that's one key piece. And did it establish, did it evolve and co-evolve with its environment? That's another thing. And then plants can expand their range. And that, I think, is something that we're seeing largely with influences from the changing climate, is that we often see plants that we used to only find in California, let's say, but in those drier environments and climates. But now those are appearing in Oregon. And as something that has expanded its geographic range without intervention, we have instances of species that we are designating now as native occurring in Oregon that before they were not part of our flora, that they had not been documented. But with these environmental changes that we're experiencing, they are establishing themselves without human intervention into our landscape. And as a native that existed, a native species that was growing in California as a native, then we are going to mark that one as a native taxon for the state of Oregon. The great thing about using natives that you hear a lot of is that they're adapted to their environment. And I think that's exactly one of the most appealing pieces of gardening or landscaping with natives is we have plants that have been growing around us long before us humans established in the places and tried to manipulate the flora and the plants growing. And they know exactly how those plants know what to expect, with our dry, hot summers and our very wet winters. And so they can deal with those. So they might have these coping strategies that let them, just survive and thrive in such a climate. Like think of camas. Often those will, in the summer, in the heat of the summer, they will have withered away and the leaves will die and you'll not know that they're even there. But then you come look at this at a wet meadow that's been soggy all winter. And then in May or so, you can see this beautiful flush of the beautiful blue camas flowers covering this field that has really capitalized, as so many of our native species obviously do, on adapting to the climate and thriving in the conditions that exist. So I think Susie and Andrea are going to talk some more about this, but one of the reasons that it's some of the perks that you get from choosing native species to include in your plantings are sort of big picture level things. And one of those is that, like I was just saying, these plants have adapted to the conditions, so they don't need a lot of coddling or special care or fertilizers or extra water all summer. Definitely some plants may enjoy and really literally soak up that extra water you give them. And you may be able to extend the bloom time in doing so. But if you didn't water them, a mature established plant, native plant, would do just fine and it would grow just fine. So it's adapted. They're easier to take care of. Just like any living creature, at the beginning, plants need a little extra TLC. So you can't just buy a native plant seedling at your nursery, stick it in the ground, then walk away and wonder next summer, why didn't it grow? Because all babies need a little help and a little extra care. And so spend for those first couple years when you plant native species, give them enough irrigation, enough fertilizer to establish them, take care of them, and then you're going to reap the benefits. Just like with children, ultimately they go out on their own and They do amazing things, and that's certainly going to be the case with your native plants in your garden too. Another benefit that Andrea is going to talk a lot about is how native species support native wildlife. And think different kinds of pollinators beyond just honeybees, because honeybees are not a native pollinator. They're great pollinators, but there are so many more. And the appendix in volume 2 of the flora has a whole list of solitary bees and that are native to Oregon, and the plant genus or species that these bees have been associated with. So you can start from the pollinators, insects, beneficial insects, to amphibians, to birds, to mammals. All of these things benefit when they have access and nutrition and habitat from plants that they evolved with. It's also good to acknowledge that so many good native plant nurseries are using seed sources that they have either collected from the wild or propagated for a certain number of generations, and that's helping keep genetic diversity present. You hear a lot in vegetable gardening about heirloom varieties and things that aren't just taken from one clone. And that's a really important way to protect the diversity that exists in our natural world. And native plants, and using these in your garden when sourced from reputable nurseries, is going to be a great way to keep alive the treasure of the diversity that exists in our natural world. And the last piece that's important to me is that using native plant species in your plantings give you a real sense of where you are on the planet. So often we just are inundated with sameness and cookie cutter stuff. You know, if you walk into a Starbucks, you don't know if you're in Eugene, Oregon, or if you're in Jakarta, Indonesia, because they all look the same. And so why use plants that look like anything you can find from Topeka, Kansas to Florida to Washington State? Using plants that grow only here, that grow in your area, I think really ties us to this place on the planet where we are, and is, I think, gives a lot of spiritual and psychological grounding that really, I think, is one of the rewarding pieces of growing plants yourself. So as you think about, and as the future speaker is going to talk in more detail about how can you integrate native plant species into your plantings, into your gardens, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You don't have to, well, you can be a purist if you want and say, I'm only going to have native plants in my garden. It doesn't have to be that way though. You can mix and match, find a native species that serves the functions that you want to achieve in your garden. Do you need a privacy hedge? Do you want something for butterflies or pollinators to come and visit? Think about the functions and see if there isn't a native plant that can accomplish those functions, instead of using those things that are native perhaps to Midwest America, or native to even Asia or Europe or something like that. So some of that I'm going to show you on our website, some of the tools that OregonFlora offers to help you choose those things. So you might want to be totally engrossed and enmeshed in your gardens, and maybe you have the time to spend lots of time. Great. So you can choose some of those more challenging plant species to grow. Maybe you want something that's easy. There are lots of great species that will, because they're native, will just sort of take care of themselves and serve their landscape function in ways that you don't have to put a lot of elbow grease into. And maybe you're looking for, maybe pink flowers just bring you such joy. Certainly then find some native flowers that, native plants that have pink flowers that will make you smile every time you look out there in the springtime and in the summertime. So parts of features to consider as you're thinking about gardening with natives are some of these that are listed here. But one of the ways to sort of approach, especially if you're starting anew, or even if you just want to insert native plants into a garden bed or a corner of your landscape, is sort of flip the scenario that we often have. So often we walk into a store, we're overwhelmed with the beauty of this lush foliage or these gorgeous flowers and say, that is a pretty plant, I want that. And then you take it home and try and find a place for it. Well, that's nice, but let's instead think about it the other way. Look at where you're planting. So start with the land, the habitat, the environment, and then see what's the best plant that I can use to maximize the conditions that I have. So instead of being seduced by the beauty on the shelf or in the seed catalog, look at what you have and then go back to those resources that OregonFlora offers you. Remember, I was telling you, you can use these ecoregions as sort of reference landscapes. You can say, okay, I want to make I have, this dry, well-draining sort of slight hill on the back of my property. I want to make a Willamette Valley savanna type habitat. I've got a couple of native Gary oaks there. So then go look and see what kind of plants can be found in these ecoregions, what sort of plant communities exist, and then those would be the ideal plant species to put in, because you've matched them to your environment. So that's the habitat, whether it's something that has existed that you're going to try and modify through your plantings, or if you have new property or you're removing an old lawn or something and starting anew, you've got new habitats. You can create little micro habitats as well, and microclimates. Maybe you have an old shed wall or something that is lovely for reflecting winter, southern sunlight, that will give a little warmer spot when you plant next to that. So you can use these things, whether it's a man-made structure or a natural structure, such as an existing large tree when you moved onto your property, or the trail that the dog always makes going back to their little spot from your back door. All of these features can be used to sort of be part of your, in some ways, part of your hardscaping, as well as little communities and little conditions that make for microclimates and little micro habitats. Okay, so I promised you that there were some online references that our program, OregonFlora, does. And so what I'm going to do is change and go to our website. Let's see if I can do this correctly. So I'm going to reshare my screen with. Okay. Yes, so I think everybody hopefully sees the OregonFlora website. So if you haven't visited our website, I hope that after these 3 great talks that you're tuning into this afternoon, that you'll have a chance to do this. So what I'm going to do is give you a quick tour of some of the resources that OregonFlora offers. The website is OregonFlora.org, and it does represent, though it's so much more, it represents all of the knowledge that we have been working on for 28 years now to create a flora for our state. So in doing this, we have amassed and built a very, very extensive database. And we've spent all of our time, our staff time and our expertise cross-referencing this information, linking it, verifying it. And then we use all of these resources about where plants have been documented to occur, photographs of them, plant specimens from the herbaria, not only Oregon State University, but many, because of our software that we're a part of a network in Symbiota, gives us access to many, many herbaria. So we have all of these resources about, what a plant looks like, written descriptions about it, where it occurs, that is all based on information for the flora. So it's gorgeous. We've worked super hard to make this an engaging, exciting, fun website that's easy to access and easy to understand. It's not just built for scientists that work in universities or in government agencies. This is built for every person, and you can just drill down as deep as you want. So let's take a real quick tour right now through all of some of the different features that we have, and hopefully you're going to find some that appeal to you. So over in the tab under Explore, this is a list of the many different tools that are available on our website. So certainly you can go look through these as you want. We have a mapping tool that is GIS based, that lets you define an area. You can draw your own little polygon or shape on a map, and then pull up the plant diversity of that area, getting all a list of all of the occurrences that we have documented in that area. Or you can look at the distribution of any plant. You can type in any number of plant names like Oregon grape, and see where on the map, even beyond Oregon, these plants occur. The Identify Plants tool is a great one, because so often we don't know what we're looking at all, but we do usually know where we are in a vague sense on the planet. So if you're out on a hike or something, you see a really cool plant, you don't know what it is, you can say, oh, okay, well, I'm over here near Eugene. You can look, zoom in the map, and then tell me, OregonFlora, what plants have been documented around that area where you put the dot on the map. Well, for that particular place, OregonFlora has documented 695 unique plants. And what you see on the right is a list of all of these plants. And, it really is a bunch of Latin and Greek. But over on the left, you want to know what your unknown plant is. So you simply choose a character that you recognize, and then that will winnow down your list. So let's say I recognize that I'm in a forest, so I'm going to select forest, and my 695 plants have now been winnowed down to 411. You can continue to do this, and you can choose any combination of features that you want. You don't have to choose everything from every category or anything. And then you can keep narrowing down the list. And then when you get to a stage where there are a reasonable number of choices, you can simply photo ID, because every single plant name, remember all those 10,000 names, has a profile page about it. So here's another great tool for the OregonFlora website that maybe is going to be the first place you want to look. You can go to the search box that's always at the top of every page, where it's also on the home page, type in a plant name, and you will get a fact sheet like this about that species. So it gives you some of the details, such as scientific names, is it a native, a non-native, if there's other information. This is also, then it tells you, we tell you through a map where this plant can be found. And so this is an interactive map. And so you can go click on that and then get information from every single dot. We have a whole suite of characters that we've put into different fields that you can then find and look at that. we have some descriptions. When a plant description has already been written by OregonFlora, we include that here, and here are all of the details that, all this incredible detailed information about a plant. And then if there are other resources, we also include those. So Flora of North America is another series of a flora that you can look at their descriptions. And we have a gardening tool, and we're about to go to that in just a second. You also see photos that are taken in the field. These are of plants that are not in cultivated situations. Sometimes we have some seed pictures, which is really cool, and some seedling images of plants when they're young. And then herbarium specimens. For each of these, all of these pieces, whenever you look at a record, you can also get all of the details for it. So every single record that we have, whether it's a dot on a map or a photograph or herbarium specimen, and we have over almost 2.1 million different plant occurrence records, we have data that looks like what you see on this screen. So that's an impressive amount of information that we track, cross-reference, and make available to the public. So let's look now at the gardening with natives tool, the Grow Natives tool. So this is one that is similar to what I showed you in the Identify Plants tool, only it's geared for gardening. We talked a lot about, well, what native could serve a purpose that I'm looking for in my garden? And say you want something that can grow in shade. So you can select different options. You also have a bunch of different choices, such as, do you want something that might support pollinators? Or maybe, and continuing down, you might be looking for a plant that would make a good hedgerow. Every time, just like with the Identify plants, every time you select an option for a character that you're interested in, the list winnows down. And then, so you have all of these different choices, and then you can go and get a customized garden profile page. So over here, this gives you this lovely photograph that gives you sort of a visual sense of what it's like, and then details over on the right-hand side. What can you expect with this plant? How big is it going to grow? What kind of light does it tolerate? Is it hard to grow, or is it easy to grow? And then another one is, what sort of plant palettes or types of garden situations would this be found in? And so mock orange would work well in a pollinator garden, or a rock garden, or a woodland garden. And each of these plant communities or garden types, we have a list of plants that's another way that you can use these resources to say, what would be, I want to make a pollinator garden. What plant species would be appropriate to put in that? And use this as a resource to help you figure out ways you can integrate these kinds of native plant species, and what sort of characteristics they have, or sort of services, ecosystem services they can provide for you to help you meet your gardening needs. And then we always link back to our core profile page, or the information that we have. So that's a lot of information, I know, and hopefully it's something that has piqued your interest into what OregonFlora offers, especially as you're interested in gardening with native species, or using them for landscape purposes. And certainly there are some other things here to look at. I'm just going to real quickly say a couple of them. As I mentioned, we have the Flora of Oregon. We're working on creating volume 3. We're really close. Like I said, we're counting months out to this publication. So if you're interested in this work, here's some things to look at. And then I'll just give a plug that we do work with many volunteers, especially through the Native Plant Society, who's been a great sponsor and partner for us. And we welcome involvement from people, and we welcome support, because as a program that's funded All that we do comes from grants and donations, as opposed, we don't get direct support from the university or from agencies. And so if you find our resources useful, we really welcome you to consider helping us keep those available. So with that, I think I will work with Jet and see if I can answer any questions that anybody might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. That's such an amazing resource. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Sure.
We do have a couple questions here. One is, as people begin to consider using native plants in their landscapes, what is your opinion on how this will affect people's relationship to the land they're on? And will it help with efforts like the land back movements?
I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. As I sort of alluded to in one of the things that I personally find valuable about natives is that sense of place that they provide. And as we become more aware of what indigenous people have known and practiced for centuries in terms of being aware of plant cycles, of plant diversity and plant communities, we can learn from that, and we can also expand our relationship with plants beyond, again, just those things that are native to other parts of the country or the world.
Thank you. What is one thing that you think every native landscaper should know in their work?
Ooh. I think that every landscaper who uses native plants should know about what occurs on that piece of land that they're working on. And hopefully I've given, I've inspired you to think about the value of flora for learning about those things. So learning what other plants occur in a place. So remember the mapping tool that I told you about? That's something that you can explore, or even just the identify plants. You can go there and look at what plants occur in a particular area. So what plant communities might be found in a certain ecoregion or a certain area. And understanding those gives you a reference point from which you can then say, okay, here's a great looking spot of Oregon native plant communities. This is something that I can either try and emulate in my workings with plantings, or maybe you can see a different, a place that has been sort of overtaken by non-native species, invasive species. Those are things that you want to be cued into to be aware of and avoid or control native or those invasive species. So I think understanding what our plant diversity looks like is key for working with creating your own native landscape.
Thank you. Another question, is it important to combine plants that share an ecosystem such as the oak savanna? And can I find these associated plants in the database? Is it okay to combine coastal species with oak woodland species?
Yes, I think it's always okay to combine plants, especially natives. I mean, again, I don't see the sense in being all rigid about something. If you really love ocean sea thrift and you love those little armerias and they bring you joy, then plant them next to your Gary oak, as long as the water regimes and the light regimes are going to be compatible. I think it's fine to mix some things. If you're trying to achieve a really a self-sustaining little ecosystem on your property, you might find a different place. Maybe there's a better home for that little sea thrift from the coast than in your oak savanna. So I think things can mix as long as they have compatible needs, and you can find that from the garden profile pages. But yeah, so I mean, keep the joy in it. My take.
Definitely. Thanks, Linda. Another question, how often do you update your species map with new observations from iNaturalist or other records?
So we are working to develop a way to pull in iNaturalist records. We don't have that yet, so we do not routinely, we don't pull in observations from iNaturalist. And one of the key differences is that we rely on all the information that you see on the OregonFlora website is vouchered or curated, in the sense that our staff, associates that we work with, we do our very best to give you accurate information. So we aren't going to take the word and the good intentions of some person who just posts a picture on the internet and says it's such and such. We do a little bit of vetting on that through our expertise. So that's the difference between us and iNaturalist. But do know that we are working with James Mickley here at the OSU Herbarium, who's the curator and also an associate with OregonFlora, to develop the software to be able to pull and then curate subsets of iNaturalist records. It is definitely high on our list of something we want to accomplish and are working towards.
Thanks. Do you have time for one more question?
One more, sure, yeah.
Okay. What are some good resources for acquiring plants for planting or cuttings apart from foraging?
Glad you asked, because on the OregonFlora or on the Grow Natives tool, we are going to include, we're working to, by the end of the year, to start integrating as one of those filtering options, commercial availability. And that has been such a challenge. People get all excited from talks and presentations and reading about stuff about native plants. And then you're like, where do you find them? And so we're going to be including as a searchable character nurseries that we have through the years worked with as good native plant providers. And there are a number in the lower, Willamette Valley, as well as, the Siskiyous and Portland region. So look at these, these reputable native plant nurseries, support these small businesses, because it's a lot of very hyper localized hands-on work. And those are the really good sources, and look to our Grow Natives tool for a little bit more help on helping you locate those vendors.
Well, thank you so much, Linda. Definitely appreciate your sharing with all of us tonight. And there are a couple of comments and thank yous in the chat as well.
Okay.
So just we'll see you next time.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Yay, thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Yay. So everyone, we're just going to take a couple minutes while we get our next speaker set up. So now's a good time to take a quick break. I love all the hearts. Hey, Andrea.
Hi.
Okay,
How's
now
it look?
I see your slide now. This is great.
Very good. Thanks again for the preview this morning. That really helped.
Yeah. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce you, and then I'll let you pipe in when you're ready.
Okay.
And just to the person who asked the question about bees, Andrea is going to be talking about bees and pollinators. So I left that question for her to answer. We didn't forget about you here. Okay, so Andrea Halliday is an OSU Master Gardener, and she became a Master Gardener in 2022. She's involved with the Master Gardener Native Plant and Pollinator team, compost specialists, and the Water in the Garden groups. She and her partner are in the process of restoring a native landscape on 19 acres of reseeded clearcut by removing invasive species, diversifying the trees, and planting native plants.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And we are blessed to have 19 acres. So what's good about my talk and Susie's talk is Susie's will talk about landscaping when you have less land. And I'm going to be talking more, we're going to sort of zoom out and talk about native plants in general, but some of the native plants I will mention will have a tendency to spread and may not be what you want to have at a smaller garden, and Susie's going to be addressing that. So I have a little bit of a different background. My experience really is over the last 3 years since I retired. So the only reason I bring that up is I'm not nearly as much of an expert as Linda or Susie is. But the reason I bring that up is just to say, if I can do it, you can do it. So I've been doing it we've been doing it really well. We've been diversifying our clear cut for a long time, but we've really been concentrating on native plants for the last 3 years. And I'm someone that 3 years ago, a plant would have had to trip me to pay attention to it. So this is something anybody can do. You just have to sort of dip your toe into it. And what we're trying to do is provide you with the resources to help you choose the right plant for the right setting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead. I'm talking about creating a habitat for birds and pollinators. And Linda talked a little bit about this, but just to reemphasize, a native plant is a plant that occurs naturally in a region in which they evolved. And native plants have formed symbiotic relationships with native wildlife. And I'm going to talk a lot about what a symbiotic relationship is and why they exist. And these symbiotic relationships have really developed over thousands of years. They are very vital to preserving biodiversity. So, and Linda talked a lot about this. So this is a picture of a camas on the right with a pollinator. And the advantage of native plants is they can grow under a wide variety of growing conditions. Many are drought tolerant, which of course is becoming increasingly important to us. And all are adapted to local garden soils in their places of origin. So native plants, I just want to mention that specialized relationships are the rule in nature. And the most important specialized relationships are among insects and plants. On the left, this is a Oregon silver spot butterfly that's endangered, that has a very special, their larvae have a very special relationship to violets that only grow on coastal regions. So if any of you have been along the coast with Big Creek and Rock Creek, the local inhabitants around Big Creek really went to the bat to prevent a large development there, because it would have really removed some of the last habitat for this butterfly. So habitats are vital to ecosystem functioning, and the removal of habitat is a lot of why we're having reductions both in insect numbers and bird numbers. So just to give a refresher on energy systems, the producers are going to be the grasses and the flowering plants and the crops, but the primary consumers that are then going to give the transfer the energy to the quaternary consumers are going to be the insects. So insects are extremely important. So Why do we have specialized relationships? Well, plants are very tasty and they don't want to be eaten. So they are the primary way that energy moves through the ecosystem. However, they have toxins in their leaves, and the toxins are to prevent them from being eaten. So the specialized relationships have a lot to do with which insects have developed ways to deal with different toxins. So milkweeds use a toxic cardiac glycoside that protects their leaves. And the monarch butterflies only lay eggs on milkweed because they have developed the enzymes to make the cardiac glycosides less toxic. So that's a really good example of a specialized relationship. So the ability to detoxify cardiac glycosides does not confirm them the ability to detox other toxins that are in other plants. So the monarch butterfly has a very specialized relationship with milkweed. And it's the loss of milkweed habitat. I've mentioned before, the loss of habitat that's resulted in a 96% reduction of monarch populations. So you might ask, well, why don't monarch butterflies just adapt to other plant species? Well, they can't adapt quickly enough to compensate for the habitat that's been destroyed. So monarchs are not exceptions. 90% of insects that eat plants are specialized. And the reason why, when you drive on the I-5 corridor and you come back and your windshield isn't nearly as spotted with insects, is because of we're losing our habitat. And 90% of insects that eat plants are specialized. So as we replace native plant communities with lawns and ornamentals, the insects that depend on the native plants decline. You can see that every time you drive any distance at all. So approximately 80% of all flowering plants are pollinated by animals, and most of these are insects. There are some birds that pollinate and bats do as well. But insects are the primary means by which food and plants is delivered to animals. And also insects are great decomposers, which are very important to return nutrients back to our soil. So when we're talking about native plants, one of the things we want to talk about is the carrying capacity, which is the ability of a place to support a species. So the type of plants you have on your landscape will determine your habitat's abundance and the diversity of animals. So to sustain insects and other animals, we need to plant the plants that support them. And that's why OregonFlora is such a huge resource, because it helps us to see which plants in which settings will support the habitat that we're trying to create. And determining which insects have the greatest impact on local food webs determines which plants we need the most. So caterpillars, it's very important to support caterpillars. Why? Because they're very nutritious, and they're more nutritious than most insects. They're high in protein and fats, and they're the best source of carotenoids for birds. So you can imagine if a bird doesn't have a caterpillar to get, and they have to go get aphids, how many aphids they would have to get to make up for one caterpillar. So carotenoids are a very important component of a healthy bird diet. And this is a picture of an American goldfinch. The carotenoids stimulate immune systems. They improve color vision and sperm vitality, and they're antioxidants. They're also a major component of feather pigments. So caterpillars are seriously diminished when non-native plants replace native ones. Yards dominated by non-native plants produce 75% less caterpillar biomass and are 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees. So this is a picture of a black-capped chickadee, of which we have locally, and they really need the caterpillars. It's amazing to think that one chickadee clutch will require 6,900 caterpillars. And to think about it from the bird's perspective, they don't want to have to go very far to get a caterpillar and bring it back to their clutch. So if you have chickadees on your property, then you must be doing a good job of supporting caterpillars. And it's not just chickadees, 97% of bird species feed their young caterpillars. And caterpillars transfer more energy from plants than any other plant eater. So native plants are far superior in their ability to sustain caterpillars, but they vary in their ability. So in other words, not all native plants are equal. So this is where we get into the concept of a keystone plant. A keystone plant is a native plant that contributes more than most others to food webs. So a landscape that has no keystone plants on it will support 70 to 75% fewer caterpillar species, even if that landscape contains 95% native plants. And again, this is something really good about the OregonFlora website, is it will tell you whether or not that plant supports bees or Lepidoptera, meaning caterpillars and butterflies and moths, and help you to determine which plants you really want to choose to get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of supporting habitat. So a keystone plant is the idea that if you remove this brick from the middle of this arch, it would fall down. And then this is a picture of a game that I'm sure a lot of you played, where if you pull out one single block, the whole thing will fall down. That's the idea of a keystone plant. So keystone plants are essential. 14% of native plants make 90% of the food for caterpillars. So keystone plants differ by region of the country. And there's been a lot of in addition to like what's going on in Oregon, across the country, to look at which plants are keystone plants for that particular region. And there are good resources for us to look at what are keystone plants in this region, one of them being OregonFlora, but also the National Wildlife Foundation, which I'll talk about in a little bit. There are two types of keystone plants I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the host plants that feed 90% of butterflies and moths, and the plants that feed specialist bees. And I'll get to that question about why would we be concerned about specialist bees when we have honeybees that can pollinate. So the National Wildlife Federation has a native plant finder by zip code. The Audubon Society does this as well. And the plants in the National Wildlife Federation website are ranked by the number of butterfly and moth species that use them as host plants for their caterpillars. And this is just the website for the National Wildlife Foundation. Again, you can type in your zip code and get a list of plants, starting with trees and shrubs, and then ground cover and flowering plants, that will show you which plants support the most number of caterpillars. And I'm going to run through some of that data. So flowers and grasses for caterpillars, strawberry is excellent. And so it supports 69 different species of Lepidoptera that their caterpillars need, will use this plant. Lupin is also a great one. That's in the upper right-hand corner, as is goldenrod in the lower left-hand corner. And then sunflower is also a great species for supporting Lepidoptera. Now, trees and shrubs that will support caterpillars. Out here on the West Coast, in our region, willow is the winner. Farther east, it's going to be oak trees. But willow will support 321 different species. And our Oregon cherry, or bitter cherry, will support 240, cottonwood 227, and alder 210. And the oak will support 200. So it's still very important to have oak out here, and I'm going to talk more about that later. Pine will support 199, crabapple 155 and the Doug fir 129. So, that's one of the reasons we're trying to get away from monoculture of Doug fir, is to have other species of trees that will support more of our wildlife. So going on to bees, Oregon has 600 to 800 species of native bees. And the reason we don't have a precise number is we're still in the process of counting them all with the Oregon Bee Project. 25% of Oregon native bees are host plant specialists. So here's the important thing. If you meet the needs of the specialists, the generalists will follow. So if you have pollinator or plants that support mason bees, for example, that can also be used by the honeybees. And why would we want mason bees? Well, mason bees, first of all, tolerate the cold better than honeybees. So they have a longer period and they come out earlier than honeybees do, in which they can pollinate. They also it takes less number of mason bees to pollinate an orchard than it does for honeybees. Plus, we also want to support our native bee population. So I'm going to talk about flowers for bees. A recent OSU study monitored bees on 23 wildflowers, and they identified 10 plants that attracted not only an abundance of bees, but a diversity of bees, of native bees, and that have unique association with native bees. And all of these plants grow well in full sun and are drought tolerant. So here's a picture of the study that they did. And one of the things I wanted to point out is they included lavender, which is not native. And I did this. I mean, when we started planting our gardens, when we were working on the land here, we planted a lot of lavender, and we like it. But and also thinking, well, this, bees love lavender. Well, it turns out that it's mainly honeybees and the yellow-faced bumblebees, which are right now not having pressure on them, that like the lavender, and that's why you see the 8. So the 8 is the number of estimated bee species supported based on 3 years of bee collections. Now, something like a Doug aster not only supports an abundance of bees, but supports a number of species of bees, as well do a lot of these other flowers that are mentioned. Now, obviously, they didn't study all of the asters that we have, and so this list that I'm giving you is not exhaustive. Trees and shrub for bees. The maple is excellent, and our maple trees, including the vine maple, are just covered with bees in the spring. Serviceberry is also really good, and that's in the upper right-hand corner. California lilac, which is a ceanothus. There are many different types of ceanothus. Some are these big bushes, which you may not have room for, but there's also ground cover and smaller bushes of ceanothus. The Pacific dogwood, which is in the middle picture there, also is a great tree for bees, as well as the red flowering currant. Attracts a lot of different bees. So for native plants and habitat, we're asking people to plant native plants rather than cultivars and hybrids. And this gets to the question of where you can go to get native plants. And I personally, there's the Doe Creek Nursery, which is really good. Also the Friends of Buford Park have a native plant nursery and sell plants for native plant. And to get Willamette Wilding has excellent seeds that they harvest locally and only keep for a couple years, so that we're sure to have growth from those seeds. A lot of our native plant nurseries, and I think that as we partner more with them, and as the OregonFlora project gets more involved with them, we'll come to understand more what a native plant actually is, and is it really a native plant that's native to our region? And also to make sure that they're not selling you a cultivar, which a cultivar will have a name that follows it. And the reason for a cultivar is to enhance a certain characteristic of that plant. So it may mean that the leaves are a different color or more color, but that they might be less nutritious. Hybrids are identified with an X between the genus and the species. And there's an example there. Sometimes hybrids don't have any pollen at all, or the flower might be shaped in a certain way that it can't be accessed by the pollinators. So this is just to let you know that I think our nurseries are starting to catch up with the movement to plant native plants, and these are things to look out for. So native bees in particular are attracted to larger blocks of flowers. Again, when you're thinking about planting and attracting birds and bees, think it from their perspective. Would I rather, as a bee, go to a flock of flowers where I can go from one flower to the next, rather than having to go from one flower and then way across the garden to the same flower? So the benefits of larger blocks are particularly pronounced for smaller bees, which will have only 150 to 300 foot foraging ranges from their nest. Advantage, if you have the room of planting shrubs and trees, is they're able to pack a lot of flowers in a small area. So you want to also think about bloom times. So it's ideal to have bloom times that start in the early spring and go through the fall. And that's becoming particularly important with climate change. A lot of our pollinators do use the blackberries, even though the Himalayan blackberries are not native, but those are actually flowering earlier now. So to have flowers that bloom later on in the season is super important. So that's another thing to look at when you're choosing plants. And OregonFlora, again, is another resource that will tell you when plants bloom. And again, we want to try to plant in clusters. So here are some ideas for spring blooming keystone plants. The maple, like I mentioned, and the vine maple, surberry, ceanothus, Pacific dogwood, bitter cherry, Pacific crabapple, willow, red flowering currant, and strawberry. All of these will support both native bees and caterpillars. And this is over here a picture of globegilia. So summer blooming keystone plants, the fairleaf Visalia, common sunflower, globegilia, California poppy, Oregon sunshine, farewell to spring, rose chickermauler, and summer lupin. Most of these plants will support both native bees and caterpillars. And the fall blooming plants. So the picture on the left is basically showing you that of the flowers they studied in the OSU paper that I talked about earlier, the abundance of the Doug aster is 100%, and the Versii is 100% comparison to all of the other flowers they studied. So, however, Doug aster will spread. So and this is something Susie will talk about, is that some of these keystone plants may not be best for a smaller area. So fall blooming keystone plants consist of common Medea, the Canada goldenrod, yarrow, pearly everlasting, and the Doug aster. Again, they all support both native bees and caterpillars. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about oak. Linda talked about it a little bit. The reason is you'll hear a lot about oak habitat. And so why is it we're now talking about how we want to restore some of our oak habitat? Well, studies will show that the Quercus hosts more caterpillars and insects than any other genus in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, as I mentioned earlier, willow does more than the oak out here, but the oak still supports 200 native species. And there are two species of oak that are native to the Willamette Valley. One is the Oregon white oak, and the other is a California black oak. And this is another thing that Linda mentioned, is that with climate change, some more of the California species native to Oregon. the mighty oak. So more than 200 native wildlife species are dependent on the Oregon white oak. And this is a nice picture of an acorn woodpecker. So an insect survey that was done at a single site in Lane County found 35 species of moths and butterfly using the foliage of the Oregon white oak. Now, it's estimated that more than 500,000 acres of oak savanna covered the Pacific Northwest in the early 1850s. And you can see the range, the white oak range on the picture on the right. Less than 1% of that pre-settlement acreage remains. And so this is part of the reason for the emphasis on oak savannas. And then I also want to mention that OSU Extension is a great resource. You can find a lot of articles on there about native plants and examples of, say, a native plant garden, as well as, using OregonFlora. And this garden shows you the dry end versus the wet end in a smaller area, and has a lot of the plants that we've talked about. So just some parting thoughts. Again, you don't have to be an expert to do this. I can testify to that. And also just don't get overwhelmed. Just start somewhere, start small, and do a little bit each year. And I've got some references I just wanted to mention. Again, Oregon State University Extension Services. They have tons of great information on their website. The National Wildlife Foundation Native Plant Finder I mentioned earlier. OregonFlora we've talked about. And there's also the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, has a lot of great recommendations for plants that support pollinators. I also want to call out this book by Doug Tallamy. He's an entomologist on the East Coast, and he talks about nature's best hope. And the reason I like this is, when I get depressed and think about climate change, I go outside and plant a native plant, because at least I feel like I'm doing something. And if we, there was this idea that we would have all of these national parks and we would support habitat by having the national parks. It's not enough room. Most of our animals need a lot of contiguous habitat in order to be able to survive. And if every single landowner planted native plants, then we would have contiguous habitat from one landowner to the next. And there's we need half the land in order to be able to support our habitat. And Scotland's going to be the first country in the world that has half of their habitat planted in native plants. And they're doing that by working with forest owners and landowners. And, in between, say, rows of trees, you can have native plants, and that will serve the purpose. So I call out this book. I think it's actually inspiring. So, and then I did find this article on the Landowner's Guide for Restoring and Managing Oregon White Oak Habitats, which I found very, very helpful. So that's it. I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Andrea. That is some fantastic information. We do have questions coming up, so I'm going to pop up to the first question, which you mostly answered. I've heard European honeybees described as extreme generalist pollinators. And from an absolute beginner's perspective, why is it important we preserve native pollinators if honeybees can pollinate most anything?
Okay. Well, first of all, we want to keep our native species of pollinators. And again, like I mentioned, some of the pollinators are actually better at pollinating some of our native species and flowers than the honeybees are. So that's why. And again, you can support the honeybees. The specialists will follow where the generalists, the generalists will follow where the specialist goes. So if you support our native bees, you will also provide habitat for the honeybees. So I hope that answers the question. Jet, you're a bee expert. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm a bee expert, but I just, the more I have learned about our native bees, you just look at them, they're so cute. Don't you just want them all around? That's my quick answer. Cheeky answer. Okay, so the next question. You mentioned that the native cherries are very good for wildlife. How about the escaped sweet cherry, Prunus avium, that grows all around? Do you know if that has any wildlife value?
That is a good question. And the short answer is no, I don't know. Jet, do you know?
I don't know. That'll be a good thing to try to figure out.
I would have to look at OregonFlora, and is it that would be, what I would do with that question is I would go to OregonFlora and put it in and see what it tells me about that particular plant. But again, I apologize for my lack of breadth of knowledge. So
thank you so much. Another question is it a good idea to plant more species for diversity, even if some are lower on the keystone list? Example, mixing yerba buena with strawberry.
yeah, I think, the thing is, again, not to be rigid about it. And there are plants that are non-native that do a good job of supporting our habitat. And so it's just that you have to have, in order to be successful in having birds and a diversity of bees, you have to have some of the keystone plants. It doesn't mean they all have to be keystone. And I think Susie's going to do a really good job of addressing that.
Thank you. Another participant says, I have a lot of yerba buena growing wild and have been transplanting it as a ground cover, but it's not on the NWF list. Any idea how it rates as a host plant?
Good question. So I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Susie does, if Susie's on the call.
I don't grow it, so I haven't learned about it.
But if it's not, have you looked at it in OregonFlora? If it's not on the native species, if it's not in the National Wildlife Foundation, it just may be that, they haven't probably studied every single plant. And I honestly don't know. I do, what I do advise in terms of, and what we've done here is we go around and look at what already grows here. So I appreciate that you're doing that. And then I look at whether or not it's native, and then try to get information on what, how well it does supporting Lepidoptera and bees. And so, for example, we have red flowering currants that just grow here. We have serviceberry that grows here. We have ocean spray that grows here. We have dogwoods that are just growing here. And so that tells me they will do well in our environment, and that I can therefore take a risk and plant them. So I don't know if that answered the question. I apologize. Do you know anything? Anybody on the call know anything about yerba buena?
And I just looked it up. So this is Susie, and I can share from the book Pacific Northwest Native Plant Primer that yerba buena attracts bees, bumblebees, and other pollinators. It's deer resistant, and it likes part shade and well-drained, moist, seasonally dried soil, and has a fairly wide range of habitat.
And I think Susie, when she gets to her talk, is going to refer to this resource. That is also another good resource for people to use.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions. One is there a time of day when bees are most active? We live in the forest and have a majority of the plants you mentioned, but I don't see a lot of bees.
Interesting. Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, there has to be a certain temperature for them to come out. And so, you know, I would certainly don't start to see them till it warms up a little bit, and then they will go away when it gets dark and when it gets cold. That's about the most of my knowledge. I mean, Jet, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, you are in luck if you're in Lane County. We do have a forestry program here that's running a forested pollinators in the forest series. And so look for that class and look for things coming out of that group because they're doing some really great work about pollinators in our native forests. Okay, next question. What type of willow will thrive on the coast?
Basically, any willow, as far as I know, any native willow will thrive on the coast because they tend to like wetter areas.
Yeah.
Susan, do you have anything to add to that
Nope.
yet?
Okay, yay for the willows. Yeah, and the OregonFlora,
Close.
that
Yep.
gardening is a great place to look to for what willows will grow on the coast using that tool. Another question, which keystone plants grow in dry shade?
That is a really good question. And again, most of what we have done is plant in the sun. So there are, let's see, in terms of, well, first of all, the Oregon, let's see, Trillium grows well in the shade. Strawberry grows well in the shade. The Oregon, oh, I'm trying to think of what we planted. Dry shade. Most of the plants will do well in dry shade, and you just have to water them the first year. Again, I would go to OregonFlora. I'm trying to think of, I would say Oregon, what's oh, I'm blanking on the name. I'm sorry. Susie, can you help me out here?
I don't know what you're trying to think of. A particular plant?
Yeah, particular plant that will grow in the dry
Oh,
shade.
I thought you were trying to muster up a particular one. Well, I'll tell you, the bleeding heart does quite well in the dry shade, and they're great bumblebee plants. I don't know if they'd be considered a keystone species. I'm not expert about that. The Oregon grape is a great dry-ish shade plant, and the red flowering currants I find do well just about anywhere. So there's a few more examples.
Thank you. The thing that's nice about the red flowering currant is it blooms really early.
Yeah. I call it the early garden diva.
Okay, great. So there's a few more questions here. Let's see. I'm overwhelmed getting rid of non-native invasive plants, and I haven't even gotten to planting the natives. I have 12 acres of mixed woodland, hazelnut orchard, gravel meadow, pond, ivy, herb Robert, blackberries, etc. Of course, grass. Any advice or encouragement?
Yeah, blackberries are a big problem. You can mow and mow and mow, which we've done. We have gotten to sometimes using Vaseline, only when it's like there's no wind and just on the leaves of the blackberries. And that's actually something habitat restorers use. It's supposed to be friendly with water. So, use it sparingly, but blackberries are a huge problem. Once you can get rid of them, the native plants will spontaneously grow back. It's amazing.
definitely. Another person says the gold plan is to eliminate invasive and non-native grasses, flowers, and plant the species you mentioned. For those of us who don't have the time, equipment, or chemicals to cleanse 0.1 acre or more, is there a bronze list of species and planting techniques? What meaningful flowers and grasses can I plant that might outcompete the modern cultivars that blow in from the valley farms?
That is a great question, and that is really what Susie's going to cover in the next talk, a lot of that. So I'm going to defer to her.
Okay. Another person asked, can you talk about maintenance, weed control of areas you've planted on your 19 acres?
That is a great question. So maintenance, yeah. Well, we have to do thistle patrol, and we have to get the thistles out before they will bloom and spread. And we have to go and dig out the weeds. So we've just committed ourselves to spending a couple hours outside, which is a good way to get some exercise, and basically maintaining our native plant beds that way. Now, once they really, they really start to fill in, then there's less work that you have to do. But every time there's a new bed, it has to be maintained. So I guess the other thing that we do is we try not to bite off more than we can chew. So we do a certain amount of native plants that's new that we figure that we can water for the first year or so and make sure we can weed and dig out the blackberries. The other thing is we dig out the blackberries around our native plant beds, because we're not going to be doing any spraying there. Again, we try to minimize how much spraying we're doing, but there are good gardening tools that will actually help you dig up blackberries and cut the roots. I mean, you can never get them all out because there's a bulb and then they've got roots coming out in all different directions. But if you keep at it, and as the other plants grow up and provide shade, they will back down. I hope that answers the question, but it does take some effort.
Thank you. And another question. One, do you have any resources for propagating native plants? And two, do you have any proven strategies for converting lawn to native gardens?
Those are two great questions. And the Native Plant and Pollinator Group is doing on December 9th. And that starts at 10, right? But I guess it's been subscribed, but maybe we could figure out a way to make it more available to public on how to propagate. And there are also books that are available out there for native plant propagation that can serve as a resource. Getting to the echelon, that is also a great thing. And we are working on putting together a program on how to develop, take part of your lawn and make it an eco lawn. So those are things that we are working on, and we really want to support people and give people resources to do those things as well.
Great.
And if they wanted to find out more about this, there's a website where they can, well, that's how they found out about this, right? On Facebook or.
Yeah, we'll post things to our website. We also have, if you go to the Lane County Extension site, there's also a newsletter you can sign up for, and to find out about upcoming classes. Some of you might have said yes to that when you registered.